We're going to continue our discussion of group processes and organizations today, particularly looking at the power of norms to influence our behavior. From the time we get up in the morning till we go to sleep at night, much of our behavior is regulated by social norms, and in such an automatic way that we don't even think about being regulated or adhering to various norms, conforming, if you will. How do norms get the power to influence us, and what are some typical norms that arise in organizations? One of the areas that we're looking at today. The other area that we're going to dwell on deals with roles, those specialized positions that develop within groups, and its particular application and function in organizations. But first, norms. What are norms? If we go to the computer and take a look at the definition and then try to pull it apart, we see that norms are agreed upon, and I want to underscore that part, and often informal, but not always informal, rules that guide group members' behavior. The first part, the formal, informal part. There are times when norms are formal. This means that there would be then written codes of conduct for the group. A handbook that exists in organizations that tell you what the various regulations are for the organization, how to conduct yourself. In fraternities, there are, again, written codes of conduct, how you should behave, for the major ones. In society, we have laws. These are norms that are very important to the society, so important that they become formalized into laws. And when norms are formalized, we can presume that they are somehow very important for the continuity of the group. We need to regulate behavior in this way. But very often, norms are informal for most of the conventions that we adhere to. We're talking about informal norms, important but implicit, not written down anywhere. We need to learn these as we move into new groups. We seek to learn them. And we learn them by asking other people and by observing other people. And sometimes we learn them by violating them. And having stepped over the boundary line, then somebody speaks to us, and we know that we've done something that violates the norm. The other aspect of this is the agreed upon. There is group consensus supporting this. If there is very little group consensus, of what use is the norm? Of what need is there to adhere to the norm? So that there has to be group consensus for the norm as well. Norms do change over time, but often change very slowly. And we'll see that there is persistence to norms. They go from generation to generation. One generation tends to teach the next. Some aspects about norms. Norms have dimensions to them. The dimensions are behavioral and evaluative. The behavioral part of it specifies what the content of our behavior should be. Specifically, what is it we're supposed to do in the situation? When are we supposed to do it? And how much of it is approved? Okay, so there's a frequency in there as well. So if we take something like a commitment norm for an organization, typically there's a norm to be supportive and loyal to the organization. The commitment norm would say something about under what situations should you speak up and defend the organization? And how much defense is appropriate? If you defend it in any situation, are people going to think that you are so loyal that now you have blinders on to certain things? If you don't defend it at all, will people then see you as being disloyal to the organization? So the commitment norm. Another example of a norm and one that operates both in organizations and in school, is the honesty norm. It's also a norm in society. We are expected to be honest with each other in most situations. Okay? I have to say in most situations, because we all understand the concept of the little white lie or the social lie, that hypocrisy that sort of greases the gears of interaction. I don't want to talk about that. I'm talking about basic honesty. And so what are the norms for a school, for instance, in terms of honesty? We have a code of conduct here. It's written. Code of student conduct. And you're supposed to be honest, and there's not supposed to be cheating on examinations or plagiarism of work. And the strength of the norm is seen in the adherence to the norm and how people react when there is norm violation. Would you feel uncomfortable giving your answers to somebody during a test? And so, that would be such a clear violation of the norm that you couldn't possibly conceive of doing that, and you wouldn't. And moreover, you would be afraid if you did give it, people would chastise you for doing it. So that would be at one level. Another level is, how would you feel about giving somebody answers to homework? Maybe there's less adherence at that level. The norm isn't so strong. And yet, at another level, like how pervasive is it? Would you turn in somebody else who you knew was cheating? Where the norm is really, really powerful and strong, that would happen. But that goes against other norms that we have in society. It says it's not right to rat on people. And so we sometimes feel norms bumping up against each other. So you get an idea of, but it would specify, depending on the organization, what would be the appropriate level for adherence to that norm, to the honesty norm. Okay? The other aspect is evaluative, and that specifies approval or disapproval by the group. So the group sanctions, okay, and sanctions we want to think of as the notion of giving approval or disapproval, so it can be positive or negative. It sanctions the behavior, and that group sanction can either be explicit or implicit. It's explicit when somebody gives you a pat on the back for doing something and says, that was really a good job. You adhere to whatever the norm was. Or it's explicit when somebody gives us a cuff on the arm, a punch on the arm, and says, that was a dumb thing to do. That's explicit. That's the sanction, the negative sanction. It's implicit when we carry around in our head an idea that the group would approve of what I'm doing and it gives me a good feeling. Or we avoid doing something because we feel the pervasive sense of disapproval that we would get from the group for disapproving of it. Customer relations norm in an organization. Okay, in terms of the evaluative dimension of the norm. We go out of our way to spend extra time with somebody, a customer, to help solve a problem. It would be explicit if the customer notifies our boss and we get commended for doing it. That's an explicit approval of it. It would be implicit just because it feels good to have helped the customer, and the customer says, gee, thanks for helping me. Performance norms in organizations, approval, disapproval. We take on an extra assignment during rush hour, or when things are particularly harried and hassled in an organization. It's explicit when the boss singles us out and notices us in front of the group for taking on the extra assignment. It's implicit when we feel like we're doing the right thing just by pitching in and helping, even though it's an imposition on time. It means you're going to have to give up doing something else, but somehow you know in the process that you're doing the right thing. And to not do it would leave you with a sense of discomfort, unease, that somehow you were doing the wrong thing. And so the strength of the norm operates whether the group is with us and they're expressly to approve of us or disapprove of us, or we're carrying around our sense of what the group's approval or disapproval would be if they knew about us. It's internalized at that point. Norms also have characteristics. There is, for norms, a range of tolerated behaviors. So if you think of a norm like an average, very much the same way as an average, and a spread of behaviors, deviations on either side, that's tolerated up to a point before the sanctions set in. There may not be as much approval, but there really isn't so much disapproval that these behaviors would be avoided. And we'll get back to that in just a minute. There is an intensity. And intensity talks about the strength of approval, disapproval. So if you would think of a curve, if you will, I'm not going to try to sketch it out. Well, maybe I will try to sketch it out. Let's see if this works. If we think of this as the approval dimension from high to low, and this one as the frequency of behavior, then the range talks about what is the spread, how frequent is it? Is it something that spreads out far, or is there a narrower range? Okay? Range of behaviors that are tolerated. The intensity aspect talks about how much approval, disapproval, and it's really talking about heights. This point here, or is it something that might look like that? There's a lot of approval for adherence, and the approval drops off very sharply. Okay, so intensity talks about the amount of approval, disapproval that you get. The two are closely related, and we're going to talk about what some of these shapes might look at. The third aspect is crystallization, and that talks about the extent of group consensus. Is there strong group consensus for the norm? Is it highly crystallized? Is it something that everybody in the group is aware of? Or is there low crystallization? It's almost as if only a few people know about this norm. It's not particularly important, and so there's not going to be a lot of adherence to it. It's not highly crystallized. It's not highly salient in people's minds. Let's look at some examples. First, for range of behaviors. Before class started, we were talking about speeds that people typically drive on highways. Okay, highways such as an interstate highway or a turnpike or a parkway. When there's no particular pressure on you to get anywhere, but on the other hand, there's also not a lot of traffic. In the state of New Jersey, we know that we're one of two states at which the speed on the highway is still regulated at 55 miles per hour. But anybody who drives on any of these roads knows that hardly anybody drives 55 miles per hour. And in fact, you're not going to get any kind of ticket or citation by the police unless you're significantly above the 55 miles an hour. How much above can you go? And about where does the norm coalesce? Well, we tried it in this class. I went around and actually asked people, and it seemed as if the norm for this class anyway was somewhere around 70 miles an hour. That's where the norm came out. And then there was tapering on either side. Some people at 65, some at 75, some even higher than 75, 80, some lower, 60. Nobody at 55. The lower reaches of it. And why is it that nobody drives at 55, even though this is, if you will say, the law, but clearly not the norm? And are there social pressures aside from individual pressures to keep your speed up? I asked some of you, what do you think it might feel like if you were asked voluntarily to adhere to, for a few minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, the 55 miles an hour? And what were some of the responses? We had some feelings here. Some people had some, figured out, they pretty much knew how they feel. Tony?
Say rather frustrated, anxious.
Frustrated and anxious, that, so there would be some negative feelings attached to having to go 55 miles an hour. And I think that sentiment was kind of echoed around the classroom. A few years ago, as a little out of class demonstration, one of my students actually did drive for a while on the Garden State at 55 miles an hour. And he said he felt that there were hot stares on him from all over the place, of people driving by and looking at him as if something was wrong with him. And was he typically the little old lady in tennis shoes driving? He was very uncomfortable with the feeling. It wasn't the frustration so much as the sense that he was getting looked on as if he were, I'm going to use the word a deviant, okay? Because in this sense, it really was deviating from what the norm is. One doesn't usually drive that unless you're held up in traffic, or maybe there's something wrong with the car. Or for some reason, you're frightened about something. So yes, there are some people who adhere to that, but we have images in our mind of who those people are. So there are real pressures that exist out there, and we call these social pressures norms, okay? And it exists, that's one side of it, so that there's sort of a floor to this, and you don't want to drop below it, because what's keeping you above it is a sense of disapproval by other people. And then on the other side, well, there are legal disapprovals that will set in if you're going too fast. And in our own heads, we probably carry around certain notions, aside from fear of getting a ticket, and that's clearly in the heads of a lot of people when they're speeding, and you kind of look at your rearview mirror a little more frequently. The other thing is, the unsafe aspect of it. So that's concerned. And then notice what happens when a state trooper drives by. Okay, and again, how these norms regulate our behavior. The norm is to drop your speed down to what the typical limit is in that area. And there is also more or less a norm that you really shouldn't pass a state trooper. Although people are doing it more frequently now, so that norm is loosening up a bit. So we see then the range of tolerated behaviors. There's another area that I wanted to mention too, where again we get the feel of the range of tolerated behaviors. And I think it's something everyone has also experienced. It's the amount of speaking that's appropriate when you're in a group discussion. And again, you can see that there is a spread, so that if anybody dominates the conversation, that's disapproved of. And there are behaviors which clearly signal disapproval in a group when somebody is talking far too long. People signal it by losing interest. They start talking to other people, they start doodling. And if it gets intolerable, then you start to see interruptions. And this person, after a while, who tends to dominate the conversation, will not be given the floor. There'll be attempts to sidestep that person. The other side of it is somebody who doesn't contribute at all. And it may well be that we're not dealing with a symmetrical curve at this point, that the pressures set in a lot sooner for somebody who talks too much than for somebody who talks not at all. But there are pressures that exist there too, and members of the group might say, why aren't you expressing an opinion on something? Why aren't you contributing something? And so again, there is a sense that there is an appropriate amount that one speaks in a group, and there are deviations tolerated from that, either side. So you can be a fairly frequent contributor, or you can be a modest contributor, still tolerated in the group. Okay, but then it tapers off so that if you're way too frequent or not at all, some of the negative sanctions begin to set in the group. So ranges of behaviors that are tolerated, and we'll see that in other areas. We talk about dress. What's appropriate dress? You see the range of dress that's tolerated. We can talk about the range of dress in this classroom. I come in looking more or less in, business, semi-casual business. I could dress more casually. That would still be okay. Students could come in dressed in business suits. That would be okay. Or casual. If we look around the class and we see that students are dressed fairly casually. But there's a sort of norm that people adhere to. Nobody came in their jammies, and nobody came in their formals. Okay, those would be clearly unacceptable. So, a range of tolerated behaviors. The other aspect we talk about is the intensity of the norm. And for those norms that tend to be important, and you want to keep behavior fairly restricted, there is strong approval for dressing, if we use the dress norm, for dressing in the appropriate way, and it would taper off and there would be immediate disapproval for not adhering to it, the norm. This is particularly the case where you see somebody using, where the uniforms would be in place. There isn't any room for deviation around that. You're expected to wear a uniform in certain situations. Policemen wear uniforms. If we go to a hospital, and again we look at this approval, disapproval, different units of the hospital have different approval ratings for what's tolerated. And so you get some strong, if you go to, for instance, a surgical unit, everybody dresses in scrubs there. That's it, that's the approval for it, there's nothing else. You don't see anything else there. That's what it has to be. On the floors these days, nurses are no longer uniform in their uniforms. There is some variation, but you can't go too far beyond that. So that falls off very rapidly in terms of disapproval. You have to adhere to a few things. And then you can go outside a hospital to other organizations, and again you see that much like in the classroom, in terms of the approval, disapproval type of rating, that approval sets in. Disapproval can set in pretty quickly. There's one other example that I wanted to use too, which is kind of interesting. Outside of organizational behavior, but clearly within the purview of behavior, and that is approval for adherence to what we think of as the typical male role and the typical female role. Let me toss out a question to the class. Which of those roles do you think has a wider range of behaviors, tolerated behaviors attached to it, and probably less approval for adherence to it? Okay, which of the two, male role, female role, in terms of range of tolerated behaviors? Anybody have any ideas? Yeah, Tony.
I would say the female role.
Female role has more or less of a range?
More of a range.
More of a range, right. That's okay. That's exactly the case. That females are allowed to engage in far more behaviors, either those that we think of as being highly stereotypically female, or those that verge more on being masculine, without experiencing disapproval. And this goes from the time that they're very little. It's okay for a girl to be a tomboy, to dress up in her brother's clothing, okay, till now when we've expanded career opportunities that are available for women in almost every area. Not every. There are clearly some areas that I don't expect to see women. I don't expect to see them on professional football teams. Although they do play football, but they play it on a informal level. And for males, there is much less of a range of tolerated behaviors, and the intensity for adherence is much stronger. And again, if we look at it from early on as an example of range and intensity, it's not okay for males to dress up in their sister's clothes or in their mother's clothes or to play with their sister's toys. The sanctions set in fairly quickly on that. So there isn't a range of those behaviors. And interesting for males, even where parents, shall we say, are liberal, broad-minded, and are willing to indulge their sons, there is enormous pressure from the male peer group not to engage in those kinds of behaviors. Not so for females. Females don't get that kind of peer pressure in terms of range of behaviors that are permitted. And if we go on to adulthood and we look at roles, clearly there are roles available for males that may not be so available for females. But while we've opened up careers for females in most areas, there are a lot of areas where males just, I mean, there's nothing to keep them from being in those areas, but we look askance at males who are in those areas. Hairdressers. Not too many males in elementary education, working with very young children, even fewer in nursery schools, and still very few in the nursing and secretarial areas. Even though executive secretaries can command a fantastic salary, there are just not that many in. And a bit of an aside on all of this, the Catherine Gibbs secretarial schools started to break the male stranglehold over the secretarial area, the secretarial career. They succeeded quite well, I think. At one time, secretaries were a male position, but that was way before typewriters, or about the time typewriters were coming in. And it's an area that switched over. Okay. Some typical organizational norms. Performance norms. The work group provides cues as to what is an appropriate level of effort. How often, for instance, is it okay to take a break? The importance of being prompt. Prompt in starting times, prompt in turning in assignments, prompt in getting back to people. There are cues in terms of a drive for continual improvement. Is the work group always talking about work and talking about ways to improve things, or is it something that's typically not done? On the negative side, the norms might be such: don't work too hard. You're going to make the rest of us look bad. Don't put in the extra effort. Take all the time you have coming to you. You're a fool if you don't take all of the time that you have coming to you. This would include not only your vacation and personal time, but it would also include sick days. Sick days are supposed to be for being sick. They're a benefit. They're not an entitlement. Okay, but there are people out there who believe if they get to the end of the year and they haven't used up all their sick days, somehow they've been taken advantage of. And sometimes these norms prevail in organizations. That message is communicated to people. Don't try anything new. There may be a norm for complaining in the organization. And always look for ways to avoid work rather than to take on work. Okay, so important cues are sent out by the social group. And if you join a high-performance work group, you're going to know very quickly what's expected of you. And if you weren't in a high-performance work group, you are going to ratchet up your effort in order to stay in that work group. One of the advantages to switching to teamwork is to take advantage of norms. But one only takes advantage of them if the norms are for high performance. Another typical organizational norm is the dress norm. And again, we have spoken about that before in examples regarding intensity. It can range from casual to fairly formalized types of business dress in an organization. And different organizations clearly have different norms that are allowed. Some might be very casual. Others, such as legal firms or some large Fortune 500s, might set a code for how you should dress. The higher up you go in the organization, there are also norms for dressing. You're expected to dress more in business dress the higher up you are in an organization. And the norms for dress are almost, unless it's a uniform that you have to wear, the norms for dress are almost always implicit. You know it by looking around, by what people are wearing. Now we have an interesting norm that has developed in organizations. It's called Dress Down Friday. It's usually a Friday. Casual days at work, where people, the norm then becomes to dress more casually at work. And casually gets defined too. And organizations have found that, in fact, they've had to define casual for their workers because some of them took casual a step too far. And they were not happy with it. So here we had a case of a vague term, casual, and it had to be defined for various workers so that they were not coming in dress that was considered sloppy by members of the organization. And again, it goes by where you are in the organization. You may find people who are high-level executives in the organization who feel that that norm is okay for everybody else in the organization, but it would not be appropriate for me to come in casual clothes. And so that person will not adhere to the Dress Down Friday type of norm. There are reward allocation norms that clearly exist in organizations. How is pay distributed? How are other benefits distributed? How are perks distributed? Very often the norm is one of equity, that it's done on the basis of effort or performance or seniority. There's some norm in place. Or the norm might be equality, an across-the-board pay raise for everybody. Everybody is allowed to come in late the day after the hometown team wins the World Series. You can come in an hour later, something like that. Across the board, equality. But sometimes other norms are in operation. Sometimes there is a norm of reciprocity that exists in organizations so that in terms of reward allocation, you're going to help the people who help you. The reciprocity norm. But some norm typically exists. There is sometimes also the social responsibility norm. You help people who need help. And the area you see this coming into play in organizations has to do with sick days and apparently banks in which you can deposit your sick leave. If it turns out that sometime it's quite apparent during the year that you're not going to need all your sick leave days, and there is somebody out there who has a catastrophe happening in the family, you can loan them, or you can give them your sick leave days. That's a social responsibility norm, helping people who need help. So different rewards for that. And the other norm that I mentioned before that typically exists in organizations is the commitment norm, the sense of loyalty to the organization. Some organizations demand loyalty, military and quasi-military. You have to be loyal to that organization. Okay, otherwise you're a traitor. And that's fairly explicit. But other organizations expect you to be loyal to the organization, but how loyal you're going to be depends on what the norm is for that organization. Are people there highly committed to the organization? Do they let people know they're working for that organization? Do they defend that organization in the face of criticism? Or is there a low level of loyalty? And so, well, yeah, you know, you're loyal to the organization, I'm willing to continue working there, but I'm not going to go out of my way to defend everything that organization does. Management expects loyalty. I don't know in these days if we have a norm of reciprocity, if there is loyalty to individuals. We talk about a trust gap these days. How is it that norms develop? How do we get to that point? Well, 4 typical ways, precedents that are set over time. That's how we do it here. It's just developed this way over time. No rhyme or reason for it. The way people seat themselves when they go in to various groups that continually meet. Some people always sit on the left-hand side, some people always on the right-hand side. They just kind of develop and they have their seats, much the same way that seating develops around the family dinner table. There's the father chair and the mother chair, and the places where the kids sit. Why? I don't know. It just develops that way. And typically, if you talk about norms, the leader is supposed to sit at the head. When the leader doesn't sit at the head, it kind of throws the whole group off. And you have trouble orienting yourself. And interestingly, and we'll talk about this later on when we talk somewhat about leadership, where there is no leader in the group, whoever manages to sit down in the position at the head of the table is often seen as being the leader of the group. We attribute leadership qualities to that position, the head of the table. Okay, so precedence over time. Transfers from other situations. The norm comes from professional codes of conduct in organizations. This is what's expected of people. Or it comes, the norm that's established comes from another, or somebody who comes in from another organization. I can't help but use football. The norm for participation in off-season conditioning for the New York Jets changed. The expectations changed when they had a change of football coaches. And the new coach set the norm, brought it from other organizations. This was it. And people came. They showed up. That's what was expected of them. That's what the pressure was. Critical events, yet another way. The critical event can sometimes be, this is just how the founder of the company did it. That was the critical thing. And we continue to do things Henry Ford's way. That's how Henry Ford did it, for an example. Or somehow secrecy developed around the Coca-Cola formula. Why? It's just the norm that developed over time. It just happened. Or it could be something critical happened in an organization and a norm had to set in to establish dealing with something. A critical event that happened in Tylenol at one point was tampering with packages. And the norm then that quickly set in at the company that produced Tylenol was to be upfront right away with any problems that occurred. And right now, there is a concern about children taking Tylenol. And warning labels and notices are going out by the company again. Okay, that's the norm that developed for handling that situation. And then explicit rules. People are instructed how to do the job. That's how we do things here. You will be told language that you can use and that you can't use. What's appropriate for the situation. You will be shown shortcuts that you can take. That's how we do it. Okay, we don't adhere to the rule book for doing these kinds of things. It's going to take too long to do it. Here's a shortcut way for doing it. Or you can't take those shortcuts because you're going to compromise safety in the process of doing it. So norms develop over time. They are transmitted from generation to generation, and they are very powerful. I started out by saying how they regulate our behavior in big ways and in little ways. We talked about honesty, we talked about dress, but in the smallest kinds of things, our behavior is regulated by norms. How we eat our food. I happened to be watching a Seinfeld episode last night in which they explicitly dealt with a norm violation. Now, who eats a candy bar with a knife and fork? And yet most of the episode revolved around eating cookies and candy bars with knives and forks. Imagine doing that in a cafeteria or in a public eating place. there is a real power that exists in norms, a social power, in the sense that if we violate the norm, we're left with feelings of being embarrassed that we violated the norm. It's clearly one of the things that happens. We've somehow tramped on a social convention. And it jars us. One of the things that I had talked about in class, I asked if anyone had the experience, somebody holds a door open for you. You walk through the door and you're oblivious, okay? And that person brings you back from oblivion, and they say in a tone that is clearly somewhat scolding to you, "Thank you, you're welcome." I asked if that happened to anybody. You think, Diane?
Yes, I mean, it happens.
Yeah, it happens, and it brings you back, and you feel ashamed or embarrassed that you didn't respond with the proper social courtesy or conventions. But courtesy and manners are all about norms. That's exactly what they're about. There are social behaviors that are regulated. And so one of the things that you might want to try just to see what it feels like, see if you can get to the point where you can break one of these little social conventions in life. Try riding an elevator in reverse directions from what is normally prescribed. See if you can get yourself to do it. Or if in the process of doing it, you get to that point and you start to feel a little sweaty in the palms and a little palpitations in the heart and say, can't do this. Or asking two people who are seated and talking to each other at a lunch counter, even though there are other seats there, would it be okay if I had that seat? These are the conventions that we just don't break in life. These are norms. And they're very powerful in terms of keeping us in adherence to behavior. But it helps make life orderly and predictable. The other aspect of behavior in organizations that groups influence is that of roles. Roles are group positions that has a set of expected behaviors. Roles can be formal. In the formal role, we typically think of a job description, or they can be informal, and those are roles that other people expect you to take on when you come into the group, even though it's not part of your job, or somehow you take on those roles all on your own. Taking on roles makes life in the organization, again, orderly and predictable. There is a real payoff for various organizational roles that are taken on. And when I talk about roles, I want to say that I'm talking about it almost in the same way that one thinks of in terms of a play. There is a role in a play, there's a script for it. It's very much the same way in an organization or outside an organization. There's a script that you play out in fulfilling that role. Roles have some characteristics that we need to take a look at. Role expectations. That's the behavior that everybody expects of you. So the job description tells you what you're supposed to be doing in the organization. But there can be informal expectations as well, particularly for the new person in the organization. New person brings the coffee. The new person has to make copies for everybody else. The new person is expected to fill in shifts when other people can't make it. The new person gets the routine assignments. Expectations that are there, but on an informal basis and transmitted to people. You quickly learn what these expectations are. Another characteristic is that of role incumbent. That's the person who's currently filling the role. Role incumbents can, by virtue of their experience, their knowledge, their personalities, shrink a role in which they delegate things to other people, or they can expand a role by taking on other tasks and other jobs, and by being more public in it. And again, the example that I'd give of shrinking and expanding roles, again, it's a good thing the New York Jets changed coaches this year, so I have this example to use. A coach like a Bill Parcells, expands our notion of what the role of coach is. In part, the media is always asking him things and talking to him, and there seems to be a presence there, aside from the fact that he took on also the role of general manager. So he expanded it, negotiated the expansion of that role. Previous coach didn't seem to fill so many shoes. And so we can see people in the same position seem to be more powerful in that role because they add on certain things, but also by virtue of personality. Role ambiguity. There are unclear expectations about what the person is supposed to be doing. And this always results in confusion in the organization. It can come from different sources. It can be that the people who are sending expectations out, the boss, isn't very clear about what you're supposed to do. And so you wind up confused because no one's ever told you clearly what you're supposed to be doing. Or it could be that, in fact, there were clear expectations transmitted to you, but you didn't perceive them so clearly. You had other preconceived notions in your mind, and you somehow distorted what you were hearing. That can also lead to role ambiguity. Whatever the case, the consequences of role ambiguity in the organization are feelings of dissatisfaction, at the very least, and feelings of stress as it increases. One of the best examples, and this is not of individual role ambiguity, but kind of group role ambiguity, occurred when it wasn't clear at accident scenes where emergency medical treatment was needed in New York whether the police should be in charge or the fire department should be in charge. And so there was a standoff between the two, and jockeying for position until you had the mayor go in and clearly say, I think it was the fire department that is in charge once they're there on the scene. So not good to have role ambiguity, and the advice to you from a managerial position is always, for your workers, clarify, clarify, clarify. Give clear goals, let them know how much they should be doing, let them know, your workers know the quality of work that you want, and clearly deadlines. Don't tell people get it to me as soon as you can, because as soon as you can for you might mean by the end of the day, and as soon as you can for your employee might mean by the end of the week. And both of you will be unhappy. So clarify, clarify, clarify. Another aspect is that of role conflict. Role conflict occurs when there are incompatible or mutually exclusive role demands. It can occur two ways from the sender. It can occur because the sender gives you two projects to work on. Both of them are due for, both of them have to be worked on first. Okay? So you're given a conflict in terms of you don't know where to start. Mutually exclusive. A second way can be that you're answering to two bosses who are giving you mixed messages or conflicting messages about what you're supposed to be working on and how you're supposed to be doing it. Again, role conflict. Doesn't matter, you're still going to feel conflicted in it. A third way that it can occur is because there's something called inter-role conflict. You're holding two roles that are incompatible with each other. And it can be a conflict between home and work. The amount of time that's demanded at work is incompatible with the amount of time that you need at home. Role conflict. Conflict between your role as parent and your role in the work organization. Inter-role conflict. Or it can occur because somehow you have a couple of roles that you're filling in an organization. And in filling both of those roles, somewhere you wind up with conflict of interest. Your interest in one area conflicts with your ability to fully do the role in another area. You might, for instance, have a position in a consulting company outside the organization, perfectly okay. They want you to do consulting. They encourage you to do consulting. But now the question is that consulting company is throwing a bid into the company. And normally you would be in a position to make a judgment on it, but you have to recuse yourself, take yourself out of the decision-making process because there is inter-role conflict. You can't do both. Sometimes, or frequently, people who are promoted up and become first-line supervisors experience inter-role conflict, the conflict between having to give orders to your buddies. These people were your friends. You joked around with them on the job. You know what they're up to and how they're avoiding work because you did it with them. You know the shortcuts they take, and you know the complaints that they make. And now you're promoted up and you have to supervise these people who are your friends. Conflict. Because now you have to give orders to and discipline people for doing things that you had formerly done. And you want their approval because you still want their friendship. Conflict between being the friend and the supervisor. Not an easy position, and frequently people who get tossed in that position are never trained for the role. And so it's a sink or swim kind of situation. But that's role conflict. Again, this leads to not doing a job as effectively as you can, at the very least, and stress as it gets worse, as there's real conflict there. The other one is person-role conflict. Conflict between the values you hold as a person and things you're being asked to do on the job. You know what's really going on in an organization, and yet you're the press secretary and you have to get up there and essentially lie for the organization. Can you do this? The organization is asking you not to notice certain things that are going on that are not quite kosher. That's a person-role conflict. Can you do that? The whistleblower is the prime example of somebody in the person-role conflict. Here's an organization that has employed you for a long time, promoted you, and so it's, in a sense, shown their trust in you, and yet you are aware of things that are going on in the organization at this point that you believe or you know to be unethical. What do? Do you now go public with it? Because not to go public means that something dangerous might happen. You know of some dangerous work situation where people could ultimately get hurt if they stay on working in that situation. On the other hand, if you go public with it, people might get fired. Some of them might be your friends. Person-role conflict. What do? This is very stressful for people. And you may, in fact, find somewhere along your organizational life that you'll be put in that kind of conflicting position. And you may not be prepared for that situation. There's really no way that we can prepare you for that, except to give you a strong sense of your own values and ultimately holding to what you have to live with. The rule of thumb is the person in the mirror. Can you look at the person in the mirror the next morning after whatever it is that you've done the day before? And think of that as a rule of thumb for adhering to this. Organizations are getting sensitive to these kinds of things, and not only do they think about what is legally right to do, but now they are thinking about what is ethically right to do. And that is a more difficult situation. There are no pat answers to give people, because when you think about what is right, it's an it depends, and it depends changes with situations. Finally, I want to talk about typical organizational roles. the task specialist, the person who, because of experience, skill, or knowledge, has an edge in task competency. And the maintenance specialist, the person who I call the human relations guru. Invariably in groups, if there's not somebody designated as the task specialist arises because there's always somebody in the group who has more experience, who has more knowledge about how to go about doing the task. And that person takes on the role. Typically, that person is designated the supervisor or the boss. And that's the person that you go to ask questions, to ask advice, and to get help with making decisions. But that role might arise informally in the organization as well. That somebody, besides the boss, will become the person that you go to for advice, for probing their experience. What did you do when you were in this situation? How do I handle this particular situation? Experience or knowledge. What do you know about this organization? Or can you help me solve this particular problem? Because that person has shown competency in that area. So it can happen as the formal, the boss, the supervisor, as a task specialist, or informally, the guru who arises within the work group that everybody goes to, because this person has shown particular expertise. But invariably in organizations, if there is only a task specialist who puts pressure on people to perform, to meet deadlines, to ratchet the effort up, it begins to wear the group down because the group has other needs as well. And so arises the human relations specialist. And this is the person who is very good at dispensing rewards to individuals, stroking them on the back, smoothing out ruffled feathers, and taking a personal interest in the individual. Occasionally, these two roles combine into one person. We'll talk more about that when we deal with leadership. And so, if we take a review at where we've been today, we started out by looking at the functions of norms in groups, behavioral and evaluative components, and we looked at the fact that norms cover a range of behaviors and have an intensity. And we looked at some specific organizational norms. And now, more recently, have covered the area of roles in the organization and looked at some characteristics of roles, and then finally taking a look at particular special roles. Next time, we continue to look at group influence in the organization and how groups exert pressure beyond norms on individuals to have individuals conform to the standards of the group.